September 1939, Heston Aerodrome west of London. Air Ministry officials watched as mechanics stripped the guns from a brand new Spitfire. All 8 Browning machine guns came out. The ammunition boxes followed. Then the armour plating. Then the gun sight. In their place went cameras. 2 F-24 aerial cameras with 5-inch lenses, mounted in the wings where the guns used to be. The officials thought this was madness. Britain had fewer than 2,000 Spitfires. Fighter Command needed every single one. And here was this Australian civilian, Sidney Cotton, demanding they hand over precious fighters just so he could rip out the weapons and turn them into flying cameras. What those officials did not understand was that this unarmed Spitfire would become arguably among the most valuable aircraft Britain ever produced, not because of what it could destroy, because of what it could see, photographic reconnaissance, and the interpretation work at places like RAF Medmenham supplied a huge and often decisive portion of Allied strategic intelligence. A PR Spitfire provided a key sighting that helped locate the Bismarck. The V-1 flying bomb was identified from photographs taken by an unarmed aircraft. Every beach at Normandy was mapped by cameras, not guns. The PR Spitfire, stripped of every weapon it was designed to carry, photographed every German secret worth knowing. Remove the guns from the most famous fighter of the war, and you create something far more dangerous to the enemy. The man behind this transformation was Frederick Sidney Cotton, born in Queensland in 1894. Cotton was a First World War pilot, an inventor, a businessman, and according to the RAF establishment, an insufferable rogue. By 1939, he was running a colour film business called Dufay Colour, which gave him the perfect cover for what he was actually doing, flying covert reconnaissance missions for MI6 over Nazi Germany. Cotton operated a Lockheed 12A Electra from Heston, using his film company as a front. He modified the aircraft himself. 3 RAF F-24 cameras hidden in the fuselage with their serial numbers scratched off. Leica handheld cameras concealed behind wing panels, triggered by a cable running to the pilot's seat. Extra fuel tanks that extended range by 900 miles, and a pale, duck-egg green paint scheme that rendered the aircraft nearly invisible at high altitude. Between March and September 1939, Cotton flew 15 covert missions over Germany. On July 28th, he invited the commandant of Berlin's Tempelhof airfield for a pleasure flight down the Rhine. While his German guest enjoyed the scenery, Cotton's hidden cameras quietly photographed German military positions along the entire route. According to aviation historians, his Lockheed was the last civilian aircraft to leave Berlin before war was declared, but Cotton knew his Lockheed was too slow. If war came, he would need something faster, something that could outrun fighters instead of trying to fight them. He needed Spitfires. The formal proposal came from Flying Officer Maurice Longbottom, who submitted a memorandum in August 1939 titled Photographic Reconnaissance of Enemy Territory in War. Longbottom argued that reconnaissance required, in his words, small unarmed aircraft stripped of unnecessary weight and equipped with cameras and extra fuel, relying on high speed, a fast climb and high altitude to avoid enemy defences. He specifically named the Spitfire Mark I as the ideal platform. The Air Ministry rejected this completely. Prevailing doctrine mandated armed reconnaissance using Bristol Blenheim bombers at medium altitude. Senior officers considered the Blenheim adequate for the task. The idea of diverting scarce Spitfires from Fighter Command and then removing their weapons was considered reckless and absurd. Cotton's unit earned the derisive nickname Cotton's Crooks from the RAF establishment. Then reality intervened with brutal clarity. In the first 4 months of war, according to operational records, the RAF photographed 2,500 square miles of enemy territory using conventional armed reconnaissance aircraft. The cost was 40 aircraft lost. Cotton's tiny unit of 2 unarmed Spitfires covered 5,000 square miles in the same period without losing a single aircraft. Air Chief Marshal Dowding was convinced. He released a dozen more Spitfires as reward. Cotton's unit evolved through a bewildering succession of official names. Heston Flight in September 1939. Number 2, Camouflage Unit in November. Photographic Development Unit in January 1940. Photographic Reconnaissance Unit in June. Finally, Number 1 PRU in November 1940. Cotton himself was relieved of command in June 1940. Officially for unauthorized flights and financial irregularities during the fall of France, but fundamentally because his independence was intolerable to the RAF establishment. Wing Commander Geoffrey Tuttle replaced him, professionalizing the unit while preserving Cotton's innovations. The first 2 PR Spitfires, serial numbers N3069 and N3071, were transformed through a process Cotton's team called cottonizing. All 8.303 Browning machine guns came out, saving roughly 200 pounds of weight. The gun ports were sealed with plaster of Paris, then sanded smooth. Panel lines were filled and polished. Every external surface was finished to a mirror shine to reduce aerodynamic drag. The radio transmitter was removed. The gun sight was replaced with a camera control box. The total weight saving from removing all armament, ammunition and armour was approximately 450 to 530 pounds. Combined with the sealed surfaces and polished finish, this translated to 15 to 30 miles per hour additional speed and 2,000 to 4,000 feet of extra operational ceiling. That margin meant the difference between life and death at altitude. The result was a Spitfire capable of 390 miles per hour, 30 miles per hour faster than the standard armed Mark I. With an operational ceiling above 30,000 feet, speed and altitude became its only defense. Cotton iterated rapidly. The Type A with 5-inch lenses proved inadequate for detailed intelligence. The Type B added a 29-gallon rear fuselage fuel tank and F-24 cameras with 8-inch focal lengths. Longbottom flew the first Type B sortie on February 10, 1940, photographing Wilhelmshaven and Emden in northwest Germany. The breakthrough came with the PR Mark IV, designated Type D. This variant carried 218 imperial gallons of fuel, compared to the standard 85, through revolutionary wing leading edge tanks holding 66 gallons each. The Type D achieved an unprecedented 2,000-mile range for a single-engine fighter. Approximately 229 were built, entering service in October 1940. PR Spitfires could now reach targets as distant as Stettin in the Baltic. The most important variant was the PR Mark XI, with approximately 470 built during the war. This was the first photo reconnaissance Spitfire designed from the outset, rather than converted from a fighter airframe. Powered by the two-stage supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, 63 or 70, it reached 417 miles per hour at 24,000 feet, with a service ceiling of 44,000 feet. The camera installation was sophisticated. The Mark XI typically carried two f/52 cameras with 36-inch focal lengths for high-altitude work, using large format negatives with up to 500 exposures per roll. Camera specifications varied by mission and variant, but at 40,000 feet, a 36-inch lens could capture detail invisible to the naked eye from that altitude. The F-24 camera used smaller negatives but remained useful for lower altitude work and oblique photography. Split-pair stereoscopic photography, with two cameras fanned slightly off vertical, produced overlapping images with 60% coverage between successive frames. When viewed through a stereoscope at the interpretation center, these created three-dimensional terrain models. Interpreters could measure the height of buildings, the depth of fortifications, and even estimate the caliber of gun emplacements from the shadows they cast. Camera heating was critical. At operational altitude, ambient temperatures could reach -50 degrees Celsius. Without heating, mechanisms would freeze solid, lenses would fog with condensation, and film would become brittle and shatter in the transport mechanism. Cotton pioneered the solution during his pre-war flights. Hot air ducted from the engine exhaust to sealed camera bays, keeping optics clear throughout missions lasting up to 7 hours. Now, before we see what these aircraft actually discovered, if you're enjoying this deep dive into British aviation, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. All right, let us get into the combat record. The operational achievements of PR Spitfires read like a catalogue of the war's decisive intelligence moments. On May 21, 1941, pilot officer Michael Suckling, aged 20, took off from RAF Wick in northern Scotland. Flying over Grimstad Fjord near Bergen, Norway, he spotted two large warships from 26,000 feet, despite Messerschmitt 109 fighter cover patrolling below. Suckling photographed the ships, landed at Wick, shoved back his canopy, and shouted to the ground crew that he had found them. He flew the Prince to Coastal Command headquarters himself. Interpreters confirmed what he had captured: the battleship Bismarck and heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, preparing to break out into the Atlantic. The entire home fleet scrambled within hours. Winston Churchill ordered the images published as the pictures that sank the Bismarck. Exactly 2 months later, on July 24th, Suckling was killed by anti-aircraft fire while photographing the battlecruiser Scharnhorst at La Pallice in France. He was 21 years old. Flight Lieutenant Tony Hill discovered the Würzburg radar installation at Bruneval on the French coast in December 1941. His camera failed on the first attempt, but he reported seeing what he described as an electric firebowl about 10 feet across sitting on the cliff top. Returning on December 5th with functioning cameras, he captured photographs that Professor R.V. Jones, the head of scientific intelligence, later called classics of their kind. A neat radar dish, 3 meters in diameter, clearly visible against the grass. Those photographs directly enabled Operation Biting in February 1942. British paratroopers landed at Bruneval, overwhelmed the German garrison, and captured critical Würzburg components including the pulse transmitter and receiver. The raid revolutionized British electronic countermeasures for the remainder of the war. Flight Lieutenant Hill was shot down over the Schneider Armaments Works at Le Creusot in October 1942. He died of wounds in a Dijon hospital. He was 28. The Peenemünde intelligence chain demonstrates the full PR system at work. On May 15, 1942, Flight Lieutenant D.W. Steventon photographed heavy construction work near Peenemünde on the Baltic coast while on a mission to Kiel. Interpreters at Medmenham studied the images but could not identify what the Germans were building. The structures matched nothing in their reference library. On June 12, 1943, Squadron Leader Gordon Hughes photographed what appeared to be large cylindrical objects lying horizontally on road vehicles near the same location. Still, the interpreters could not determine their purpose. Then, on November 28, 1943, WAAF Flight Officer Constance Babington Smith sat in the dim interpretation room at RAF Medmenham, magnifying glass in hand, studying yet another set of aerial photographs. In the aircraft section where she worked, every image was scrutinized for new German designs. On this particular print, she spotted a tiny cruciform shape on a launching ramp. It measured approximately 20 feet in length with stubby wings. It was the V-1 flying bomb, caught on camera months before it would begin falling on London. Her discovery triggered Operation Hydra, the massive bombing raid on Peenemünde in August 1943, which delayed the V-2 ballistic missile program by approximately 2 months. It also triggered Operation Crossbow, the systematic destruction of V-1 launch infrastructure across northern France that continued until the launch sites were overrun by Allied ground forces. Babington Smith also identified the Messerschmitt 163 Comet rocket fighter and the Messerschmitt 262 jet from PR photographs, detecting these secret weapons years before they entered operational service. For D-Day, PR Spitfires photographed the entire coastline from Bordeaux to the Scheldt estuary, not just the Normandy beaches, to prevent Germans from deducing the actual landing location from the concentration of reconnaissance activity. RAF Medmenham produced 1,500 intelligence reports and 600,000 photographic prints per month during invasion preparations. By war's end, the Interpretation Centre had analysed over 8.5 million photographs. Every beach obstacle at Normandy was mapped and catalogued. Every gun emplacement was located and measured. Every potential glider landing zone was assessed for obstructions. When Allied troops landed on June 6, 1944, their commanders knew the terrain better than the Germans defending it. Over 40 British and American photo-reconnaissance aircraft flew sorties over the beaches that day, providing real-time intelligence on German movements. No PR pilot is more legendary than Wing Commander Adrian Warburton, known universally as Warby. He held the D-Zone Bar, DFC and 2 bars, and the American DFC. Marshal of the Royal Air Force Lord Tedder described him as the most valuable pilot in the RAF. Born in 1918 and christened aboard a Royal Navy submarine in Malta's Grand Harbour, Warburton barely scraped through pilot training. He was initially posted to Malta as a navigator and observer. Within 4 days, he had his pilot status reinstated through sheer persistence. From Malta, Warburton flew nearly 400 operational sorties before the Fleet Air Arm's devastating attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto on November 11, 1940. Warburton photographed the harbour at such low altitude that his observer could read the names painted on the Italian battleships through binoculars. When his cameras failed on one approach, he simply flew lower and tried again. He was shot down by a Messerschmitt 109 over Beaune in Algeria. He survived the crash, was arrested by Vichy French authorities as a suspected spy, talked the local admiral into providing him transport to Gibraltar, borrowed a Spitfire from the garrison there, and shot down a Junkers 88 bomber on the way back to Malta. On April 12, 1944, flying a Lockheed F-5B Lightning on a reconnaissance mission over Germany, Warburton was shot down by anti-aircraft fire near Lechfeld Airfield in Bavaria. He was 26 years old. His remains were not found until 2002 when a Welsh aviation researcher named Frank Dorber matched American missing-in-action records with German anti-aircraft battery logs. Warburton was buried with full military honours at Dernbach Commonwealth War Cemetery. The PR Spitfire's survival depended on a simple equation. At 40,000 feet and 400 miles per hour, nothing the Luftwaffe fielded could reliably intercept it. The Messerschmitt 109's performance degraded significantly above 35,000 feet as its supercharger struggled with the thin air. The Focke-Wulf 190A, with its BMW 801 radial engine, struggled above 20,000 feet. The PR Mark XI operated 4,000 to 8,000 feet above the effective ceiling of most German fighters. Standard evasion procedures called for maintaining maximum altitude, diving away using superior speed if detected, observing strict radio silence throughout the mission, and planning routes carefully to avoid known anti-aircraft concentrations, Germany attempted to counter the threat with specialized high-altitude interceptors. The Junkers 86P and R variants could initially reach altitudes above any British fighter. The 86R reportedly touched 47,000 feet in testing, but at a maximum speed of only 224 miles per hour, it was desperately slow. After a series of successful interceptions by specially lightened Spitfire Mark IXs, in August and September 1942 over southern England, the Junkers 86 was withdrawn from operations over Britain entirely. The Arado 234 jet reconnaissance aircraft, capable of 461 miles per hour, was genuinely threatening. It was the world's first operational jet reconnaissance platform, but only 274 were built, and they entered service far too late to affect the strategic outcome. The ultimate PR Spitfire variant was the Mark XIX, with approximately 225 built. It combined a Rolls-Royce Griffon 66 engine producing 2,035 horsepower with a 5-bladed propeller and the first pressurized cabin fitted to any PR Spitfire. Maximum speed reached 445 miles per hour with an operational ceiling between 42 and 43,000 feet. The pressurization system maintained a differential of 2 pounds per square inch, equivalent to a cabin altitude of 28,000 feet when the aircraft was flying at 40,000. Earlier PR-11 pilots had endured the full physiological stress of unpressurized flight at extreme altitude, relying solely on oxygen systems and physical endurance for missions lasting many hours. Approximately 1,000 PR Spitfires were built or converted during the war. The dedicated reconnaissance variants were manufactured by Supermarine at dispersed shadow factories across southern England, rather than the main Castle Bromwich plant, which concentrated on fighter production. The PR Spitfire outlasted every other variant in operational service. On April 1, 1954, Squadron Leader W.P. Swaby of No. 81, Squadron flew PR Mark XIX PS-888 over jungle in Malaya, searching for communist guerrilla camps during the Malayan emergency. The aircraft had the last painted in white letters on its engine cowling. It was the final operational RAF Spitfire sortie. 9 years after the war in Europe ended, the doctrinal lineage from Cotton's stripped Spitfires to the Cold War spy planes is direct and acknowledged. The principle of relying on altitude and speed rather than armament, carrying cameras instead of weapons, flying alone rather than in formation, is precisely the concept behind the English Electric Canberra, PR-7, the Lockheed U-2, and the SAR-71 Blackbird. The motto that emerged from the PR Spitfire era captures it: alone, unarmed, and unafraid. One pilot translated it more honestly: alone, unarmed, and scared to death. The PR Mark 19 PM631, which made the RAF's final Spitfire flight of any kind on June 10, 1957, survives today in the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Several PR Spitfires remain airworthy, including PL965, a PR Mark XI at North Weald in Essex with its original wartime Merlin 70 engine and period camera installation. The PR Spitfire inverted every assumption about air combat. The weapon that mattered most was a camera. The protection that worked was not armour but altitude. The pilots who arguably contributed most to Allied victory carried not a single bullet between them. From Cotton's pre-war espionage flights to the identification of the V-weapons, the tracking of the Bismarck and Tirpitz, and the comprehensive photography that made D-Day possible, these aircraft produced intelligence that shaped every major Allied decision of the war. The approximately 1,000 PR Spitfires built, a fraction of total Spitfire production, generated a strategic impact that historians increasingly recognise as perhaps the type's most important contribution to victory. British engineers took the most famous fighter of the war, removed everything designed to kill, and created something far more dangerous to the enemy. The unarmed Spitfire photographed countless German secrets. For much of the war, few German aircraft could